we're coming to the conclusions. In a sense, it's really just the beginning. But I will try to give you some overview of the extraordinary journey that we've made in these last hours. If we try to get at the essence of what makes an alphabet, well, Diringer said that the alphabets follow religion. I think we can go further than that. The alphabets are intimately connected with religion, but it's not religion just in the sense of believing in Buddha or Shiva or Mohammed or Christ. It is more in the deeper sense of religion as law or Torah or Dharma. It is a way of understanding how we fit in to a larger picture. So it's about identity, it's about ordering ourselves and the world, starting with chakras and then going on, how we believe, how we explain creation. So the letters aren't just about being able to speak some words, but these are the words that in fact create the world in which we live. And ultimately, as we've seen, they are about life. They are about how we breathe. They're about how we move. Our movements define the letters, but the letters are also an expression of how we move as we live. And so Shiva is not only the god of destruction, but also the god of the Nataraj, the god whose 108 movements make the world into the wonderful place that it is. And to make all this possible, we create templates to aid us in making this all systematic. We said there were 6,609 languages in the world. The ethnologue actually says that there's probably 7,000 and so on. The exact number isn't important. We, in the West, have been used to thinking that it all begins with Proto-Semitic or Canaanite or Phoenician or Hebrew or Greek. The purpose of these lectures has been to show that that's all valid, but that is only a very small part of a much larger picture of letter making, alphabet making, and that the alphabets that go A, B, C are just one version of those that go A, B, G, D, or A, B, V, G, D, and so on. And that that there is a much bigger picture that isn't along the coast of the Mediterranean, that even the Western alphabets of Europe don't have their origins on that coast, but start in places like Assyria and start in northwestern Saudi Arabia. But that's the narrow picture. The larger picture, as I've tried to show you, has two great sources, one Slavic and one Hindu, or one Indian in the larger sense, including Nepal, of course, and Bengal, and Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and so on. And when we look more honestly at those two, here is an Indian picture of the world. It is highly symbolic. On the surface, it's what we expect. Well, yes, they're the lotus people. They eat lotuses and they make lotuses, and they're the lotus people. So we see Mount Meru as the center of the lotus. And then we see above the Kurus, but if we read more closely, we see Siberia. Below we see Bharata, or India. Then we see Malacca. Then we see Zanzibar. Then we see Ceylon. And so what looks like an Indo-centric view of the world is, in fact, a picture of the whole of Asia, or Eurasia. And there are interpretations that this is Ireland, but I'll leave that aside. Now, if we look at the classic map of the Slavs, we see that there is a land which we write A-S-I-A, Asia, but they write Asya, which, of course, in terms of the Hebrew creation of the world, is the fourth stage of creation. And you will notice that there are not one source, but 1, 2, 3, 4 sources. One in what we would now call the North Pole, one down here, one here near the Baltic Sea, sorry, not the Baltic, the Baikal Sea, and in the Altai, and one here closer to what we think of as Russia. And they tell us that 2 Slavic and 2 Aryan languages came together in the midst of time to create those earliest alphabets. And what I've tried to suggest to you in these lectures, I mean, this was lecture 1 talked about the whole spaghetti. This was lecture 1, where I talked to you about the prehistory of these with the shamans and the symbols that became split into 4, and then you get individual letters. And then in lecture 2, I showed you that Sanskrit, although since the time of Panini, is linked with 7 Vargas going this way, probably almost certainly started in the Indus Valley when the Vargas went horizontally, and that there was a prehistory there as well. Well, when we then look at early alphabets, we realize that the only alphabet that goes from way up north down towards Europe and then slightly into Europe are the Turkic languages. And here is one map of how they go. Here's another map of how they go. There are no less than, well, there are over 20 of them that go here. I'm not going to go into the whole history of that, but then the Turkic become one of the keys to understanding how things that start with the shamans go south, and then clearly this one, parts of this then go down to India from the Altai and become the Sanskrit. I've suggested to you slightly heretically or slightly provocatorially that since in that early map, Algonquin, so a North American Indian alphabet was linked with Sanskrit, that just as those North American Indian letters or alphabets were linked with the 4 points of the compass, just as the Chechen one was, that probably initially you had a great symbol, then you split that up into a series of symbols on the 4 points of the compass, and then just as the Chechens broke that up and wrote it out in a systematic way in terms of columns, that the Hindus did the same for Sanskrit, and to create first the Panini version and then the Aryabhata version, which creates a syllabary of those same letters. The earliest letter forms, as we said, were not letters in the sense that we know today. They were pictograms and then ideograms. Well, here is a page of pictograms and ideograms of Vinca script. We're now in modern, the northeast corner of Serbia, and here are some simplified symbols from Indus script. There are claims in the last decades that Indus script has been completely solved and that it is directly the source of Vedic. There are great debates about this, and you can find 5 books to prove that it is so and 5 that it isn't so. That the basic structure is the same, we have shown with the Vargas, but that there are individual symbols like the swastika, which, as we saw, is a letter in Slavic, and I will show you is a letter in a number of alphabets around the world, that this Trishula-like thing, which comes up as a letter in multiple languages, is also there. So there is a clear link between this and what comes after, but there are a few chapters missing. Some optimists have taken the Vinca script and argued that this is the basics of both the Futhark and Old Turkic. Here is one map of the evolution of the Armenian alphabet. It's beautiful, it's extraordinarily impressive. It says that we start with petroglyphs, that we then have hieroglyphs, then syllabic, and then alphabets. It shows you these things back as early as 18,000 BC. We looked at a couple of those in detail, and then we see this. Dramatically missing from this explanation is the use of the swastika as in the generation of the letters. Dramatically missing from this is the Christian claim that there was a gentleman at the beginning of the 400s, at the time when Armenia officially became part of Christianity, who wrote the alphabet for the first time, according to the Christians. Well, the Christian view is wrong. I would argue that even this view is wrong. Well, it is one interpretation, but it has actually hidden the template-making prehistory using swastikas, which, as we saw, is closely linked to the Russian school. Now, I can't summarize all this 20,000 years of letter making in the course of the next hours, even if this lecture was going to be 26 lectures in itself. I'm going to just take you through a few examples to give you some glimmerings of how there are connections. So here we have a detail from that Armenian alphabet. Here you see early letters of spirals. Here is a spiral in the earliest Karuna of the Russians. Then here you see letters of Abrami. And here you see, again, a number of early letters where this spiral comes up, even in the alphabets of Adam. And a variant of this is to make from that a kind of hook thing like this. Or I take this shape, well, here's our little man, that is the letter Ha, also connected with the swastika, as we saw in the Ugaritic early Arabic version. But then we see this kind of thing of an E and a backwards E, which we associate also with Pisces here and here. And then it also links with two horses, and you see this kind of thing. And the two horses, of course, could also be the Aswin twins, who are both two human beings, but also two horses in various versions. We saw that this kind of yoking, if I can put it that way, with a Y, of a backwards E and an E created F in some languages, Y in other languages, and so on. And here we see variants across the languages, and that then leads to Libra in one of the early hieroglyphs in Egypt, and of course in the 1990s produces the euro. And it's the Tsampi letter, and it's 82 of the Bulgarians backwards. So even looking at this, we suddenly realize that things that are completely different on the surface, thousands of miles apart, are somehow connected because there is this deeper story of letter making that is about making the letter, switching the letter, doing its mirror, turning it 90 degrees, another 90 degrees, and so on. And in fact, the more we look at these things, the more we realize that there is so much we don't know. So here in that early Karuna alphabet that, like Sanskrit, has letters hanging from it, we have the letter est. Est means it is in Latin. But here we are in early Proto-Russian. Here we see it again, and it becomes fehu. Here we see est in this form. And now we see it in an energy version and also in a letter version. And then we see it linked to this letter, and again, a kind of human energy mudra. And here we see it in a more systematic way. And here we see it linked with a pentagram and a hexagram, and then leading to a backwards euro. Or here we go back to that first symbol that we saw of Mara or Mari, also known as the god Tengri. Here it is in the Volksfronten flag. Here it is in a North African alphabet. Here it is as a Polish pastry. Well, then we can take bits of it and it becomes XYZ. We can see it here in Russian things. Here we see 1/4 of it as, again, one of those earliest Russian symbols. Then it becomes this one. Then it becomes the Chinese yuan. Then it becomes the Japanese yen. And then we see 2 Russian letters. So we have gone from Middle Asia to Northern Europe, to Russia, back to Russia, to China, to Japan, and back to Russia, all in a single page. And again, this linking of a symbol that splits into letters, that splits into symbols for money, that splits into further letters, and then combines in new ways. So here we see how the symbols get split into letters. In the final bit of this talk, I'm going to show you how the letters and symbol making go in different directions in the West, whereas in the East they remain more interconnected. But first, a little more about the larger world picture of this. So we have the Trishula that we are now fully familiar with, and we have seen it in the Russians. Here you have the letter Cha in one of the Indian alphabets. And then we saw this 2-fold version and the 3-fold version. That becomes Ha and Ha. And so here we are in Russia, India, southern Yemen, and South Arabic, in fact, which also spreads over into Africa. Well, this is related to that story that we told in the introduction, where we have basic symbols. They split to favor one of the axes. Then the axis becomes a letter, and that then gets spread. So I take 4 of those, I get 1 of those, or I get 4 of those, or those, and then I make a symbol. So again, the story of how the symbol splits into 1/4 to become a letter. And we saw in the 144 letter version of the 104 bukovi, as they're called, or letters, how a plus turns into a backward F, then goes into a backward swastika, and then goes to become a Facebook sign, and then becomes a normal swastika, and then an upward swastika. That this version was called a posilon, and this version called a swastika letter, and that this then leads to different versions of what we would call a B. Well, this is an R and this is a B. So this is really repeated 4 times to get that symbol. And now we see that those 2 B's turn up in different languages. The 2 swastikas here, that swastika becomes a letter in Georgian. Here it is a letter in Arabic and Ugaritic. Here it is a letter in other alphabets, and then 1/4 of that becomes the letter G in Russian, and finally in Greek. Here we look now in more detail at that buku, and we see the mudras connected with it, and the word go, and we see the mudras connected with that in terms of a whole body, and then in terms of a finger or a hand. And then we see variants that lead us to what we think of now as the beta. And here we see that there are, this is now again a subset of that alphabet from 11,000 years. Here we see swastika and other letters. And here we see a modern textbook that explains how some of the, well, how A is either a rising bird or and how B is this trishula that comes down like that. Now this one is particularly interesting because here is a whole page of this, a so-called ornamental glagolithic. Well, if you look very closely, you'll see that here you have a backward swastika constantly repeated. Well, it's not just a swastika, it's one of those swastikas with the energy going in 4 directions, and then a slice comes with the knife. You notice also that we have the antlers of a deer that are 3, and that the B, the boiki, imitates the antlers of a deer. And here then are various versions of that, and then that leads to this formal letter, which you see here in different alphabets again. And it bears some relationship to the B of Beth in the alphabet of Adam, but only roughly. Now I take that same B and I turn it around and I turn it upside down and it becomes an L. And now I flip it 90 degrees and it becomes a well-known person, Mem, and is the letter M. It becomes Moira, and then we have alphabets where this M-like shape defines almost the whole of the alphabet. My point here is not to trace every one through every alphabet, but to show you that a symbol that starts in Russia goes west, and then by flipping it in various ways, the mirror, and so on, starts to lead us to the key letters in other key alphabets. So there is an underlying structure story going on here that will never be understood if we say, oh, you have to study only Sanskrit letters or only Russian letters or only Adamic letters or whatever. And the same kind of thing happens if we look at the sky. So I showed you this image at the beginning of my lecture on the heavens. Now we'll look at that in just a little more detail. So we see that this is linked with a 6-sided star. And here is a drawing that shows you that that is the Hagalaz rune. So, and here you see the 6 points. That 6-pointed star comes as letter 15 in the Proto-Bulgarian alphabet. And it links with the letter Z, which is linked with the candelabrum boy that we saw in the earlier versions. And it links with the letter Zamek in the Hebrew tradition. So what looks like just, I make a line and draw an X on it, which we saw was part of making the world tree, now is linked to a specific constellation in the sky, is linked with a specific star in a specific rune, a specific star, a specific letter of Russian, and a specific letter of Hebrew. Or in that same lecture on the heavens, I showed you that this little man was Cepheus. Well, there he is again in a Nordic thing, and here he is again. And he looks suspiciously close to this letter of early Hebrew and to this man in Arabic. Here is a lovely page from one of the those texts that most of us have forgotten. It shows you some of the first letters of Slavic, now in a systematic way. So this is Slovo, which is one of the words for, letter, but you will recognize it obviously also as the Bindu. Here you see the two circles creating a Vesica Pisces, but with Slovo in between, and this is called Vede, from linked to Veda. If I superimpose on that an E and a reflected E, I get Est, the background of which I showed you a few minutes ago. And if I now impose a T on the double E's, then technically I get a test, but the test is in fact Tverdo and the next letter of the Russian alphabet. So what looks like just a little lune or a little lunule or bit of the moon suddenly becomes a systematic way of letter producing. And there are textbooks that show you that in more detail. Or here you have the word vita, the word for life, in that earliest of the Russian alphabets. Here you have vita again. And here you start to see how vita gets made in terms of letter making. And this is vita once again. And two of these bits together give me mo, and or rekye. Now this rekya can give us this figure, or I can turn that upside down and it gives me what looks like a B with a cross on it. But if I look very closely, I see that that's a superimposition on the Big Dipper, or on the so-called Big Bear. So what looks like a letter is actually a mapping of the most important, one of the most important constellations of the heavens. And then here in this version, this is a kind of child's book, but it's a child's book of great detail, and you start to see how the letters are made in a fairy tale version. Or I take this O, turn it upside down, and I have an M. I combine them and I get a mo, or I get this, and I combine them again and I get a kind of vortex that you would find in the universe. Now, in his 1937 fundamental book on the history of alphabets, Diringer said that there were 4 stages: the embryo writing, picture writing, ideographic writing, phonetic writing, which then subdivided into syllabaries and alphabets. In his fundamental work of 1937, Professor Diringer suggested that there were 4 stages of alphabets. First, embryo writing, then picture writing, then ideographic writing, and then phonetic writing, which he split into 2, syllabaries, and finally the alphabet. And his book was mainly about the alphabet. In light of what we have been discussing, I would suggest that the embryo writing is obvious, the picture writing is obvious, but that when, by the time we get to ideographic writing, that we need to define two further subdivisions. One is the ideographic alphabet. Letters go in parallel. We saw that with Suryani, we saw it with all the magical alphabets of Egypt. That is to say, you have alphabetic letters, such as Arabic or Hebrew or whatever, but you also have a, well, we'll just call it a sign language or a funny shape, which is not competing with, it's simply another way of writing the same thing. In the Arabic tradition, one of the most famous examples would be Muznad, where we saw that they have these curious signs, which are like capital letters in the Western world, well, for Romance languages, and that they use when they're making monumental script on monuments and on buildings and so on. And that the second subdivision of this ideographic writing is what I would call a universal significance of letters. What's usually said is, oh yes, they made all kinds of symbols, and then they slowly got that 5,000 down to 1,000, down to 500, down to 150, and then finally down to the amounts that you could use for everyday use in languages. And when they got to the stage where it was completely abstract, then we got to the stage that we could create words which had meanings. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't agree with this. Because as I've shown you very beautifully, I think, with the one about the early Russian letters, that we start with a half moon, Slovo, which is the word for word and also in some cases for letter, and then Vede, which is a combination of two spheres with the little Slovo thing in between, and then we get the other letters. And so it's when these so-called abstract letters have behind them either a cosmological thing in the heavens or specific mudras on earth, when these are recognizable symbols that have a universality of their own, that the letters don't become, well, eventually they become abstract and we forget the history. But there is this whole history to them. And it's that history that makes the phonetic writings in syllabaries and alphabets possible. So in a sense, the whole of this lecture series has been to say, the history of alphabets has been too much about section 4b, and really the key to understanding how we get to alphabets today is to look at that middle prehistory, that period between 5,000 and say 2000 BC, before the kinds of alphabets that we now use daily get started. And once we acknowledge that there is this prehistory stage, then we start to see connections between the symbol making and the letter making that still remain in the East but have been split in the West. So here is a symbol for the Muladhara, where I need not tell this learned audience, we have an elephant, obviously. He's one of, well, in the narrow sense, he'd be one of the 4 world elephants, but because he's Airyavata, he's one of the 8 elephants linked with the 8 compass directions. But above him is the bit of a, the first letter of Aum, the A, but now turned on its side. Well, I take you to Maastricht, to our church, and what do we have? We have basically an Aum turned on its side, and then going down as a hook here. Here's another version. So in the Indian system, this first of the chakras is linked with the first of the letters and is linked with symbolism. In the in Maastricht, this symbol has just become a wall decoration. Here is a symbol for Mata Zemlya, so Mother Earth, who in another version is this figure that looks like a 3 that again links to Aum. And if we go to these two versions of early Glagolithic, the decorative and just the ornamental, as I've called them, you see it in various versions. One where there's a woman wrapped with snakes in the way that you would expect her to be if she was in Nepal with Nagas. And the more we look closely at this, these are various versions of the letter A in various early alphabets. Basically we would say a horseshoe shape, yes? If you go to Naples and go up the hill halfway, there is a convent and there is an altar, and what do we have? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and a whole series of A's. Now, maybe he was trying to pray or sing and say, ah. However, we see that these also return in series of 4 in decorations like this. Or if we go to Tallinn in the north of Europe, we see these symbols and then below these symbols. If I go to Sumeria, we see that on a kind of altar, and it's a symbol of Mother Earth. And here you have another one that looks more like a horseshoe, and also linking with the symbol for Ketu. And so what we find as we go through the symbolism of these countries is that there is for the god Rod, for example, or Yud. Yud is, well, he's something like Shiva, but it's now, the focus is purely on the linga fashion. You can find versions where it is just the linga, more obvious than the discrete Hindu one. You also find these devilish little men in one version. You see him riding as a young man on a bull, and it's clear, and he has this stick with drums on it, and it's clear that he's not just a pleasant gentleman. There is an underlying Freudian dimension to it, yes? Or you have versions where he's made as a straw man. Or you have him linked with the sun, or he gets linked with symbols like this, which is again our swastika and the energy version. Or he starts to get linked with letters like this, which then has an upside down version. And in fact, the swastika, when we look into its history, we see that it can be, here is in that earliest of the Russian alphabets, we see that it can be Fash, linking to flame. It can be Ma, it can be Agni, or it can be Pir. Here we saw that it created the two great religions, Inglism and Yudzism. Here you see the individual letters in that earliest of alphabets. Here you see Yod now as Jew, or here you see this energy symbol now again linked with the Jewish tradition, which can also be a hexagram. And here is the letter Phi. This is again the Yara symbol or the year symbol. Here we see Zipf and Yud again, but now Yud is not just a letter, a simple letter of the alphabet. It becomes a stick and an S shape. So it is a cosmic thing. This Elif is the letter A, but we can recognize it also as the letter as in Cairo, with the energy and relate it to other of these combinations of letters that become the Christian symbols, but become also then ways of summarizing the cosmos. And to go back to the letter A, here we have different versions of A and Aum. We can make a symbol of that that becomes then a symbolic way of writing the letter Ganesh, or the name Ganesh. Of course, Ganesh is one of the sources of the alphabet, and often you see an elephant then with fundamental symbols. You see Ganesh as actually generating the letters. The swastika, here we are in Tibetan alphabets, and these are letters for the earth and for Zhang and Zung, or in the Zhangzung. And here we have Ganga, now in this form, and now we're back in Egypt, in Coptic. We saw at the end of the introduction all these funny symbols. We saw in lecture 1 how that went into kind of patterns of symbols. They get isolated into decorations like this, and then if you take bits of those, they become letters in Brahmi and in various alphabets. And now we see a mixing of the world of symbols and the world of letters. So here we have an energy symbol. Here we see another one. Here we see a symbol linked to Allah, but which is also a swastika. Here we are with the hands of God, but again swastikas and then these other energy levels, and here are African versions. So what looks, and if we take one bit of that, then we're back at individual letters. Or here we have decorations, but each of them has swastikas in them. And this one is particularly interesting. Here you have a symbol of the god Dazhbog, who is one of the sun gods of the Russians. Here I have a Latvian symbol, which is just about the same. Now I turn it on its edge, and it is a Roman symbol. Now I change the coloring, and I have this. Yes? Now, so now the ground is actually 4 Fs. Yes? Now I make the ground into the figure. Or sorry, here the figure is 4 Fs, and the ground is white. Now I change that and make the ground into the figure. Yes, the same shape. You can still see the Fs, but now the Fs are white. But now, what do I have? Lahu, and I have Allah 4 times. And if I change it this way, I am back at my Roman symbol. So I have a Russian symbol, a Latvian symbol, a Roman symbol, and one of the fundamental symbols of Islam. All the same symbol, but depending on whether I focus on the figure or the ground and which way I turn it. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a history of this figure making, and of course you can see swastikas in all of them, because just isolate bits and pieces and you'll see a swastika as well. So what I'm saying is that there is an extraordinary history in which the most sacred images of people from Russia, Northern Europe, the Christians and the Muslims are the same image, and the Romans, pre-Christian. And now I come back to this theme that I had, that I told you about. In the West, we had symbols. We isolated out of that individual letters. So here is a page of for decorations in Russia. And you see a figure 8, you will see the fivefold cross, you see the Z letter, and various other ones. So here I take that letter 8 and show that that becomes letters of the alphabet. Here is a page for embroidery, to which I'll come back in my appendix on textiles. But here you see again the Mara symbol, that is the god Tengri, yes? And here you see that Tengri symbol going through a whole series of variations. And here in the West, this is the Gar rune, which, as we saw, is based on the North Indian horoscope. But if I take that, it becomes a window, and there it is as a window in the decoration above a door in Maastricht. These symbols are the letter A if I have them right side up, but if I put them on the side, they're the letters G and H. Here they are on a decoration of a wall, and here they are on the decoration of a fence. This letter is the letter I, and is a world tree, and I see world trees above the doors of houses. Or this becomes the letter M, which I see on the decorations of doors and even in the windows. If we look at this page as a whole, in a sense you could make a history of the West out of this, because we could split it into two. We can see on the one hand how the letters become symbols, so the reverse position of the historical development. But on the other hand, we could put a stick there, and then this part becomes what we find in alphabet books, and this is what we find in everyday life. And curiously, paradoxically, most of us who walk through the streets don't notice that M, or that I, or that F or G, or that Ger. We just think, oh, well, interesting windows. And that's really been one of the dilemmas of the West, that the image making and the letter making that are intimately connected have been ripped apart. And just as a rather dramatic example, I'm going to take you to this little letter E to show you the contrast now for what happens in Europe and what happens in Asia, especially Middle Asia. So here I have a letter E. There are a lot of other letters that are connected with it. Of course, we now know that any letter is only a fourth of a symbol, so there's the fourth of a symbol. This is one of the symbols for creativity and life. And here is another version of it on a carpet. Here are various versions of it on carpets, and of course you can see these as the horns of Aries, and so on. But now it gets interesting, because it is the letter Uk. Here is what the letter Uk looks like in one version, or Oi. But if we look more closely, ladies and gentlemen, where are we? We're back to the epitome of what the male is, as we saw in that earliest of the Russian letters. So this is like the spiritual linga, if we can put it that way, but it's the breath of God. And if you turn it around, it becomes the linga, but here it's the breath of God. And now, in this old Russian Glagolithic alphabet, it has a value of 400. There are various versions of it. It can also be written as a Y, a special kind of Y. And it can be done as this symbol, yes? I blow that symbol up, and it's this symbol. And now I take you to a place called Gonur Tepe. We are now in the middle of Middle Asia, and we have an enormous ruin of a ruined city. And look at the inner part of that great, what was once one of the greatest civilizations of the world. This is 5000 BC. This is well, it's after Indus Valley, but it's before Babylon. It's before Sumeria. It's before Egypt. And here you have this enormous thing that is in fact a symbol of the letter for, which we see is connected with the symbol for life itself. And so rather than just talking about life, breathing life, making a letter of it, we could say literally, place the letter as one of the main structures in their main town that covers an enormous, well, it's the most important town within 500 miles. I now come back to our first letter. There is our symbol again, the male and the female. If I turn it around, I have the AIDS or the International Women's symbol. I can do A this way, I can do AL this way, I can do Fa this way, I can do Vit this way. Now with the little man here, and what is he emanating from his right hand? An angel, and from his left hand, the male symbol again, which is the breath of God. And so there is an extraordinary way in which the East, Middle Asia, has kept the image making and the symbol making and kept them together, and kept the stories connected to them together in a way that we in the West, we've simply chopped off the fourth part, get the simple image, then forget that it has a history, forget that it has a meaning, say that the only thing that has a meaning is a word, and even that Aleph, the letter A, is 4 letters. We just say that's letter A, just abstract symbol, that it is connected with a whole geometry and number system, forgotten. And what do we get? We really forget that we have a history of life behind the alphabets of life. And so in the East, we create not only an alphabet, but we link it with a kind of rosary linked with this symbol, and we call them Rudrakshas. And we have 54 for the men, 54 for the women. So it's 2 Sanskrit alphabets, and I get 108 again, which of course is the most important of the numbers. And there is a letter Xi in Russian, which on the one hand is just, it looks like an X where one is crooked and the other straight. But if we look very closely, we see the sun descends down this one, and then, so from, basically from Kumbh or Aquarius down to Leo, and then from Gemini back to Scorpio, we see a straight line going to a star. If I turn that by 45 degrees, I get this symbol. And I need not emphasize it too much. That's both the K and linked with the Fa symbol. And here you see a star in the very earliest of the Russian alphabet. So suddenly the letter making, the symbol making, the cosmology is all together. And here is one of those maps of the 18th century again that shows us Malabarika, Brahmanica, and then up here Scytho-Tartarica, which gives you the Scytho-Sarmatian, that gives you the Bulgarian, that leads to the Ukrainian, that leads to the Russian, and so on. So that here, in a glimpse, even in the 18th century, they are remembering that there is this whole proto-history that our Christianization of the whole thing has forgotten about. So I could spend the next hour or 26 hours just on this diagram, but this is to remind you that the story that we think of as something in the West with Latin and Greek and Phoenician and Hebrew, has at least 6 strands. China, going back to Sichuan Mesolithic, sometime around 20 or 1000 BC, to the Jiahu symbols, the Shang dynasty, the oracle bones, and the Chinese characters. Proto-Indo-European, sometime between 33,000 and 26,000 BC, not 1000 BC as Wiki tries to tell us. Then the Sumerian clay tablets that lead to the Chaldaicum syllabarium, which comes from Indicum, the Sumerian, the Akkadian, the Avestan, and then the Scytho-Sarmatian coming in, and that one. Then the Russian that leads to the early Russian ruins and those early things to the Scytho-Sarmatian, the Proto-Slavic, the Glagolithic, and then the African story that goes via the Proto-Saharan, which we didn't talk about, the Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Ethiopian, the Enochian, the Pharaonic, the Tifinagh, then the Egyptian Mercurianum, the South Arabian Musnad, and so on. And then finally the European. And so that story of Europe that we thought in our books was about what happened along the coasts above Israel, so Lebanon and Phoenicia and Syria, is just, well, the tip, not of an iceberg, but of a much bigger story that really covers the whole of Eurasia. And as my final slide, I just show you, well, here are some symbols from China. We have seen that this symbol is on the one hand a meditation pose, that if you do the 2D version of that, you get the Star of Vishnu, which becomes the Star of Solomon and the Star of David. I can have these 10 points, which on the one hand lead me just to 10 points that link up with the chakras, but then the 3 plus 7 plus 12 gives me the 22 letters. If you go to the African American tradition, they will tell us that the Ganges is linked to Ganga, to Ganja, and so, which is their word for marijuana, and they'll create out of this a marijuana plant. The Hebrews will tell you that this is the background for having Christ on the cross. Then the other Hebrews will tell you that this is an abstract thing of a triangle, a hexagram, and a square. Other Hebrews will take that hexagram and create the letters of the alphabet. But all of these are ones which are separating the symbol making and the letter making and going in different directions. And so my invitation to you, ladies and gentlemen, is to say, A, it didn't just start roughly 1800 or 1500 or 1000 BC. This is a story that started in the mists of time. Whether it started 50,000, 30,000, or 20,000, we can't be sure. But there is a very big picture where some of the same symbols, especially things like the swastika, cover all the great cultures and lead on the one hand to cultures where the symbol making and the letter making remain connected. Ones like Sanskrit, where the letter making was separated but made systematic, but we've forgotten that there were probably proto-roots where they also made diagrams. And then cases like Russia, where the whole story is still together. And the message of this is we must stop fighting Russians and Chinese and Afghans and other people, because they are actually the source of where we all came from. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of my talk, but it's the beginning of many lives of work to make these connections more visible. Thank you.